regions or areas where the U.S. questioned the possibility of communism. In July of 1944, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a meeting was held about how the world would recover from the war. Number one, they set principles for wartime recovery. Secondly, they looked at factors for the failure in the post-World War I era. And third, they came up with a system to make lending to other countries a sound investment, which led to the IMF and World Bank. There were two reasons that lending money to other countries might not be a sound investment. First, the country might not repay the loan, and second, exchange rates weren't always fair. Inflation led to the decrease in buying power, and when buying power decreases, the worth of money repaid also decreases. So, say for instance, you borrow $10 from a friend, but then there's inflation. When you give them back that $10, it's only worth, say, $8, as much as $8 was worth when you borrowed the money. The IMF oversees and approves exchange rates. The World Bank accepts pools of currencies. The effects of IMF and the World Bank included the stabilization of exchange rates, which led to an increase in willingness to invest. It also decreased trade barriers, and economic integration began to occur, which is where you use your positives to supplement other countries' weaknesses. This led to the decrease in the chance of war, and because the well-being of a country now helps all the other countries. So England's less likely to attack someone it's trading with, because as long as the country that it's trading with is doing well, they can keep trading. In 1945, the Nazis left Greece. This led to a struggle between two groups, liberals and conservatives. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Great Britain was worried, so they came to a compromise. Great Britain administered a monarchy based on a constitution, which satisfied the conservatives, but it also had elections, which satisfied the liberals. The communists protested, so they went to North Greece, which led to the question of, will Stalin help? The communists in Greece protested, and they went to northern Greece, which led to the question of whether or not Stalin would help the Greek communists, and whether or not the U.S. would help the Greek liberals. Stalin wasn't concerned, but the U.S. and Great Britain thought that he was, and that he wanted to take over the world. The U.S. gave Greece money because Greece had a very bad economy. If you lower poverty, you also decrease the chance that a country will become communist. On February 22nd of 1946, Kennan sent a telegram. He acknowledged that the Soviet Union leaders are weak because people are untrusting and skeptical, so the government needed an enemy to look strong. The Soviet Union was afraid of Western invasion and believed that it was inevitable. So they were expanding for security, not just expansion for expansion's sake. And thirdly, there was an ideological element. Truman largely agreed with Kennan's telegram, and so he supported a plan to contain the Soviet Union. The most influential people in Truman's decision to contain communism included George Kennan, Dean Acheson, those were the two most influential, William Clayton, and James Forrestal. George Kennan was the U.S. ambassador in the Soviet Union, and he wrote an article for the Journal of Foreign Affairs. He said that the Soviet Union was not expanding because of ideology. Dean Acheson worked for the State Department, and he was eventually the Secretary of State. William Clayton worked in the State Department, and James Forrestal worked in the Pentagon. In March of 1946, the same year, the Iron Curtain speech was given in Fulton, Missouri, at a college, by Winston Churchill. He described the split between Eastern and Western Europe, which got the public on Truman's side to contain communism. He used the analogy of an Iron Curtain. In March of 1947, Truman announced to Greece that the U.S. would secure its economic viability and military security In March of 1947, Truman announced to Greece that the U.S. would secure the economic viability and military security of Greece and Turkey. Truman went to Congress and said that it was the U.S. responsibility to protect and support free people resisting communism. He gave $150 million to Turkey and $250 million to Greece. The Truman Doctrine basically said that it was the U.S. responsibility to assist individuals resisting communism. In June, George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State, came up with the European Recovery Program, which is more widely known as the Marshall Plan. And he explained it in June at a Harvard commencement address. It's an economically charged plan that gave money to other countries, mostly Western Europe, to help them recover from World War I. Money was given only if they wanted it. That way, if they took it and prospered, they'd like it. They'd like the U.S., and it wasn't forced, so it wasn't imperialistic. There were some expectations if you accepted the money, though. One, you must accept and understand that the U.S. had a say in what it was allocated to and what it was spent and how it was spent. Secondly, the country must be willing to trade with other European countries because diversification leads to strength. Stalin wouldn't take the money even though the Soviet Union was in dire need of it. He wouldn't take it because it would be hypocritical, because the money was meant to stop the spread of communism, and because the money was meant to stop the spread of communism, the money would prevent communism from taking root in the Soviet Union. So if countries he wanted to, as buffer zones, were allowed to take the money, he could not maintain communism there, and so it was goodbye buffer. He also didn't want the strings that were attached. Lastly, Stalin didn't care about growth. If he did, he would have accepted the money for his buffer countries. Instead, he stripped them of their resources so that by the time they realized what was going on, they couldn't rebel against him. They were too weak. The dual policy for security was an attempt to maintain wartime alliance with the Soviets. It was ideal, but unrealistic. Secondly, they wanted to find a way to prevent the expansion of communism, which was not ideal, but it was realistic. In 1947, GATT was passed, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It created rules for international trade. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was implemented. It led to a 35% increase in industrial production since before the war, and a 10% increase in agricultural activity since before the war. More than 2/3 of all European imports were from the U.S. So even though they lent the European countries money and didn't get it back, it was given back indirectly, and this helped the U.S. economy.